Plantinga's modal ontological argument has been hailed as the victorious ontological argument, the one that finally succeeded. In its original formulation it reads, 1. A being has maximal excellence in a given possible world W if and only if it is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good in W. And 2. A being has maximal greatness if it has maximal excellence in every possible world. 3. It is possible that there is a being that has maximal greatness. 4. Therefore, possibly, it is necessarily true that an omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good being exists. 5. Therefore, it is necessarily true that an omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good being exists. 6. Therefore, an omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good being exists. As one can see, Plantinga distinguishes between greatness and excellence, and he does so for a very good reason. To understand this reason, we have to start with Charles Hartshorne and Norman Malcolm and their modal reformulation of St. Anselm's second ontological argument. Hartshorne and Malcolm followed St. Anselm and conceived of a greatest possible being. That means, in all the possible worlds, they looked for a greatest being. Suppose there is a world W in which there is the greatest being of all beings. Call it G. Does the same being G exist in other worlds besides W? Obviously, Hartshorne and Malcolm said, because if it didn't, we could think of an exact duplicate of G as it exists in W, with the difference that it also exists in every possible world, and that being would be greater. And so we have a contradiction. So, if we find a being in some world that's unsurpassed in greatness, we will find this being in every world. It will exist necessarily. But Plantinga is just, very, very good. He found a flaw. Plantinga said, fine, you have found a being G that in this one world W is greater than any other being anywhere, and this being G exists in all possible worlds. But that doesn't imply that G is greater than every other being in all possible worlds. In W, it has to be greater than every other being in W. It is even greater than every being in any other world. But is G therefore greater than any other being in, say, W1? Maybe G is not as great in W1 as it is in W, and so there is a greater being in W1. Maybe G's greatness in W is just accidental. So Plantinga thought about what it would mean to be greater than any being in any particular world. Being greater than any being in some particular world is what he called maximal excellence. Being maximally excellent in every possible world is what he called maximal greatness. And so he came up with some necessary conditions for maximal excellence. A being has maximal excellence in a given possible world W if and only if it is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good in W. And then he came up with the necessary condition for maximal greatness. A being has maximal greatness if it has maximal excellence in every possible world. And from there on the argument proceeds. Now, the crux of the argument is of course to claim that if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. William Lane Craig has, as it is just his nature, given a formulation of the argument that is maximally clear. 1. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. 2. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. 4. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. 6. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. But why would one think 3 is true? The answer is, of course, the concept of necessity. Necessary existence means existence in all possible worlds. Possible existence means existing in some possible world, so at least in one of them. So let's say it's possible that a necessary being exists. That means it exists in at least one possible world. And that means some person in some possible world could truly state, in my world there exists a necessary being. But what does it mean to say that? It means, in my world there exists a being that exists in all other worlds too. And if that is true, then of course said being exists in all possible worlds. But maybe we could ask a deeper question here. Why does it exist in all possible worlds? Or maybe even, why is it even possible to exist in all possible worlds? What makes it impossible for a being not to exist? So, an entity may have necessary existence as one of its properties, but what makes its existence necessary? One could maybe put it like this. The essence of an entity may include existence. That sounds weird and obscure, but bear with me. If we talk about an object, say an apple, we can ask what it means to be an apple. It means to be a fruit, grown from a tree, being digestible, etc., etc. But suppose there is some entity X that has the essential property existence. One of the things it means to be X is to exist. So, to be that thing means to exist. If that's even possible, then of course that thing exists, since it wouldn't even make sense to reference such an entity while denying its existence. If you say about an entity that it doesn't exist, you are not talking about X, in the same way that if you are talking about something that isn't a fruit, you are obviously not talking about an apple. But of course many people don't want to accept the argument, and yet as William Lane Craig puts it, most steps in the argument are fairly uncontroversial. It is the possibility premise that is the main focus of discussion. So, there are two main criticisms of the argument, both target the possibility premise. The first is conceptual, while the second is epistemological. The conceptual criticism targets the concept of a maximally great being in itself. It may target the concept of necessary existence and try to invalidate the concept itself, or it may target the conglomerate of great-making properties such as omnipotence and omniscience and try to show that they are not compossible. For example, if an omnipotent being could be shown to be impossibly all-knowing, then the concept of a maximally great being may be incoherent, but such attempts generally haven't been very fruitful. It doesn't seem like there is some obvious epistemically accessible contradiction within the concept of a maximally great being. But there is also what one may call the epistemological critique of the premise. This line of thought proceeds the following way. Maybe we cannot find the exact reason for the incoherence of the concept of a maximally great being, but maybe we can show, given what we know of the actual world, that there has to be one even if we can't identify it. So for example, there seems to be a whole lot of pointless, gratuitous suffering in the world. Maybe a maximally great being wouldn't allow there to be such suffering, and so it seems it doesn't exist. And if it doesn't exist, there must be some flaw in the concept, so probably it's impossible for there to be such a being. Some people also make use of their modal intuitions, stating, surely there are purely horrendous possible worlds filled with nothing but suffering and agony. But if that is so, then a maximally great being is surely impossible. This way, the incoherence of the concept is supposed to be proven by assumptions external to the concept itself by testing its supposed entailments. But then, the defender of the argument surely can make such a move himself. He can argue that if he has reasons to believe in the existence of a maximally great being independent from the nature of the concept itself, then he can use them to support the possibility premise as well. For example, he may give the existence of a cosmic origin or fine-tuning as reasons or evidence for thinking that a maximally great being exists and is therefore of course possible. So maybe we can say, as none other than Bertrand Russell himself once did, good God in bootstraps, the ontological argument works. Or maybe we shall remain unconvinced.